Is NATO or Ukraine trying to start a nuclear war with the Russians? Let's talk about it. Here is the evidence. An attack on Engels Air Base last year in which Tupolev Tu-95 Bear bombers, strategic nuclear-capable bombers, were destroyed. In and around that time, the Russians accused Ukraine of trying to create a dirty bomb that they were going to utilize and then blame it on the Russians. Now, of course, this never came to pass. There were a lot of phone calls between defense ministers of Russia and the UK and Americans, and that just kind of dissipated. Going forward to the attack on the Peskov Air Base just recently, in which numerous nuclear-capable bombers were destroyed once again. Interestingly, this happened 700 kilometers from Ukraine's border, implying that they have mastered a longer-range drone technology. Fast forward to last week, we had another attack on Shevlovsky Air Base, in which Ukraine claims to have targeted some Ilyushin Doomsday plane command and control center planes, as well as a helicopter. This is deep in Russian territory. Remember, we also have a Russian submarine, a nuclear submarine commander for their nuclear submarines, not just their nuclear-powered submarines, but their nuclear submarine program. That leg of the nuclear triad was assassinated. We have numerous attacks over the past year on nuclear storage facilities throughout Russia, not only on nuclear weapon storage facilities, but also on the places that manufacture the parts that are essential for their strategic nuclear program, be they for the ICBM program or for other aspects. Even, you could arguably say, an attack on critical infrastructure, an attack on their aviational facilities is in some way adjacent to their nuclear capabilities. Any attack on Russia's conventional forces, if Russia wanted to, could construe that as an attack on their strategic forces, okay? We also have the recent attack last night on St. Petersburg. The Russians are saying absolutely nothing about this, just like they're saying absolutely nothing about the massive attack, the massive score that Ukraine had on the Sevastopol Black Sea Fleet headquarters, where Ukraine claims to have killed their top admiral, the Russians' top admiral of the Black Sea Fleet, along with 35 high-ranking officers. Now, that's what Ukraine claims, but Russia has been very tight-lipped about it, which leads me to believe there's probably some kernels of truth to it. In addition to that, last night, eyewitnesses seen flashes in the sky in and around St. Petersburg and heard some very loud explosions about half an hour before the lights went out for 100,000 people there. Again, there is no mention of this in the Western nor the Eastern media, which leads me to believe that there is a low-intensity conflict going on in the background that both sides are trying to suppress so not to spook the population into running out there and panic buying CBRN gear and gas masks, which, if you haven't done that already, you should probably do that, because I'm going to be talking about why the risk is so highly elevated right now, why it appears that this is intentional, that this is not accidental, that the United States is in fact enabling this behavior, okay? Now, again, we didn't hear anything about that St. Petersburg in the news. It just got completely, washed away by all the other stuff that was going on with the Canadian Parliament and this, that, and whatever, and attacks on Ukraine. By the way, there's 8 Tu-95 bombers en route to Ukraine as I'm making this video, so it's very likely we're going to see a massive strike, conventional strike by the Russians once again tonight. But interestingly, the reason why I'm so confused as to why nobody is talking about it is because St. Petersburg is 900 kilometers away from Ukraine, which means that this had to either come from inside Russia or from the Baltic Sea or from NATO countries, or from Ukraine, which means they have long-range drone capability now. Anyways, we have the massive attack on the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, an attack on the submarine. I mean, every week, we've already forgotten about that massive attack on the Russian warship and the submarine that were in dry dock recently. I mean, we've already forgotten about that. That's how fast things, and that was just a week ago. We have another attack on the Diaghilevo, I'm probably mispronouncing that, Diaghilevo military air base. That one happened, I think that one happened a few months ago. We have frequent attacks on the Kremlin. We have attacks on the programs which are associated with the Roscosmos space program that's integral for Russia's intercontinental ballistic missile program. So we have an assassination attempt on the Director General of that program, and we have numerous attacks on Russia's nuclear power plants, and this list is in no way exhaustive of all of the attempts on Vladimir Putin's life, of all of the attempts on numerous propagandists within Russia and other facilities related to Russia's nuclear triad. So if the Ukrainians are trying to directly target Russia's nuclear capabilities, even if it's inadvertent, even if they don't mean to target the nuclear facilities per se, but these conventional attacks on Russia's conventional forces has an effect, an eroding effect on their nuclear capability, then eventually Russia will have to respond towards NATO, because NATO is the one enabling this. If the United States was against Ukraine doing this, they would have already said so, or they would have stopped enabling them with copious amounts of weaponry and financial support, and even longer range weapons that appear to be enabling this behavior even more. So this leads me to believe that they're trying to start either a nuclear war, or they're trying to kickstart the war between Russia and the United States. We very well could see a war between the United States and Russia before the end of next year. Maybe this is why Tucker Carlson was so convinced that there was going to be a war with the United States and Russia. Obviously, there's a lot of political motive there. There's a lot of financial motive. God knows what has gone on in Ukraine that they're trying to cover up or they don't want to have come out now. Okay, maybe they're hoping that they can keep this at the level of conventional hybrid warfare and it not go nuclear. Who knows? Either way, they're either trying to provoke a Russian response, or they're trying to gradually erode Russia's nuclear capabilities and their retaliatory capabilities. And if the latter is true, that means that Russia will ultimately have no choice but to target NATO in some way, shape, or form, either in terms of their military bases in Europe, and obviously the United States I'm referring to here mostly, or maybe that means taking out some reconnaissance planes that are aiding and abetting these drone attacks. Maybe it would amount to them taking out Starlink satellites. They're going to have to respond if this is very gradually eroding their capability to fight a nuclear war. If it is compromising their nuclear deterrence, they will be forced to act. And it appears as though that's what Ukraine is trying to do. Now, I'm not saying that they've decimated the Russia's strategic nuclear triad yet. I don't even think it's even close to that yet. Russia has so many cards up their sleeve, nuclear cards up their sleeve. I don't think they're close to that yet. But eventually, they're going to do something that oversteps a boundary. Maybe they do a cyber attack that compromises Russia's command and control. The Russians interpret this as them trying to neutralize Russia's ability to launch a counterattack, or a first doing it under the guise of a proxy war kind of creates plausible deniability for NATO. So NATO can say, well, we never approved Ukraine of doing this thing that has now compromised your nuclear deterrence, but Russia will have no choice because now it's vulnerable to NATO nuclear attack, so it's going to have to attack first. So you see how this can escalate accidentally. It could escalate voluntary or involuntary. It could be intentional, unintentional, or accidental. Now, Russia has ordered their military to halt the Ukraine offensive before October. Vladimir Putin has advised Sergei Shoigu to make sure that this counteroffensive is wrapped up by October. But I was looking at the feeds today, and apparently the Ukrainians have been making some headway in the south. There appears to be fighting in and around Tokmek, which means that they've breached all of the defensive lines. Now, I don't think they've breached them all definitively, But if that is the case, then they're making it much farther than anybody would have expected. And here's the problem with the new ATACMS missiles. And here's the problem with what's going on in the Black Sea. I'm going to tie it all together for people now, okay? So please try to pay attention. I don't have the map today because sometimes it's just easier for me to focus and do this out of my mind's eye. So we have the Black Sea RQ Global Hawks that are flying there all the time. These are NATO reconnaissance planes. They are spotting for Ukraine, but they're also, according to Denis Pushlin of the Donetsk People's Republic, he is claiming that they're actually engaging in jamming capabilities that is somehow compromising Russia's ability to defend themselves, to activate their missile defense. This is probably why they're getting these Storm Shadow missiles and Scalp missiles through. Okay, now if this is the case, and they are actively doing that, Russia has no choice then but to intercept these reconnaissance planes. The question will be, how are they going to engage them? How are they going to intercept them? Yesterday, I showed you a video. We showed you on flight radar as a result of some findings of an acquaintance of mine on Twitter who found that there was a doomsday plane, a Russian Ilyushin emergency plane. These are like the command and control planes flying very close in the Black Sea. This is something neither of us have seen before, especially when there is a U.S. reconnaissance plane there. So were they trying to jam that plane? Is that the game that is being played right now, in that they're not trying to take it out kinetically, but they're trying to jam it? Because understand, when the ATACMS roll in, the first thing they're going to go for is the Kerch Bridge. They're going to try to take out the Kerch Bridge because that is the primary supply line into Crimea. It's not going to be the end of the Russians in Crimea, but it could very well be the beginning of the end, because that means they're not going to be able to resupply. Is this the ace that the Ukrainians have up their sleeve, that they are going to wait until they can get within range, take out the Kerch Bridge, try to neutralize all of the Russian supply lines, and that is when they come in with the Blitzkrieg maneuver in who knows what direction it's going to come from. For all we know, it can come over the Dnieper River in the Kherson direction. I still think it's possible that they come across in the direction of the nuclear power plant, using pontoon bridges or some means of getting across the river. It's possible. I'm not saying it's likely. I'm just saying it's possible. So do not count out Ukraine from this fight just yet. There's a reason why Putin is trying to order this halt to the Ukrainian counteroffensive by October. Is it for political reasons? Does it have something to do with the economy there? Is this why they're rationing gas and diesel and not exporting that stuff to even their ally countries? Is it because they're about to start heavily bombarding critical infrastructure and they want to go on the offensive of their own? There's rumors that they're getting ready to do a massive offensive of their own in and around Kharkov, Kherson, numerous regions along the front. Is that what's happening? I don't know, guys, but all I know is that it seems as though somebody is trying to start some shit. And as the saying goes, like a person who is drowning, if you try to help them, they will pull you down. It is possible that Ukraine is doing these provocative acts and been given the green light to do so for Washington, or by Washington, I should say, so that they have a reason to get more involved in the war, ensuring that there's political stuff that is favorable to the current government there in the United States next year, and not only there, but everywhere, because every NATO country whose leaders are slumping in the polls right now, unfortunately has a lot to gain by a full-scale war with the Russians. There's seldom a lame duck presidency or leadership in wartime. So could it be that the U.S. is turning a blind eye to these acts of sabotage that are trying to provoke the Russians into doing a tactical nuclear response in Ukraine, or try to target military bases in Europe outside of Ukraine? Is it possible that they're trying to provoke a response or turn a blind eye to that response? Because when you have a proxy player here like Ukraine, it creates plausible deniability for the Americans. The Americans can say, well, we didn't start it, and you understand they need that because it's the Americans could never just nuke Moscow first. You know, I mean, that would be so frowned on by the global community that they would never be able to do that with impunity. So they have to make it look as though the Russians are the ones that initiate this somehow. So what likely will happen is Ukraine is going to do something that steps over a red line. Russia is going to retaliate because they see the only way, and they're going to retaliate against NATO in some way, shape, or form, because NATO is enabling all this. Like the example I gave you in the Black Sea, okay? So they're going to have to respond, and then NATO's going to say, see, oops, see, look what they did. Now we have to respond to that. And then that is when the escalation is going to happen. And right now, the United States is sending F-16s to Romania to help enforce a no-fly zone in and around that region. I think it might actually have something to do with enforcing the grain corridor, which is now actively being used, openly being used to smuggle goods. It's being protected by the British Typhoon jets and now protected by the F-16s. Apparently Romania needed this support in order to have this no-fly zone over their border because the Russians are attacking the ports. So this means that the Russians can no longer attack the ports where the weapons are coming in. So you see how we are forcing the Russians to attack us, okay? Now, according to the RAND Corporation, they have done a risk assessment throughout this entire conflict, and they've determined that there is a medium to high risk of a nuclear escalation. In fact, by their own metrics, they thought that Russia would have escalated long ago, that many red lines would have been overstepped and that we would already be in a nuclear situation, okay? So they've been building various escalation ladders, and it was assumed that Russia would either use tactical nuclear weapons or attack military bases across Europe by now. But they haven't done that yet, okay? The predictions of these American experts, this article claims, about the escalation of the conflict by Russia has turned out to be inaccurate because they underestimated Russia's risk tolerance. Remember, this is the nation that's seen 20 million of its inhabitants. I know that number seems to be exaggerated all the time, 30, 40 million. Throughout World War II, let's just stick with 20 million, okay? So they are no stranger to making sacrifices for what they perceive to be the greater good. Now, what are some situations and how could this possibly escalate is the question, because we're really getting down to crunch time now. There is a clear-cut scenario for how this escalates. Like I already explained, America, NATO is enabling Ukraine to do strikes against the Crimean Bridge. Crimean Bridge is arguably the linchpin with this whole thing. If they can't resupply efficiently, then there's a good chance that Ukraine can make a breakthrough to the south, and then after that, all bets are off. So it's likely that Russia is going to have to intercept those recon planes that are enabling all this, possibly engaged in jamming capabilities or jamming activities before this shit hits the fan. Here are some examples of how the shit can go down according to the experts, okay? So the Russian forces strike the territory of Ukraine and their official representatives of a NATO member state come under attack. Okay, so this could be like what we've seen in Romania, where they are targeting the ports, or maybe they're targeting near the border with Poland and Lviv or Western Ukraine, and the country's leadership demands that Article 5 be invoked. Russia, in anticipation of this, because before Article 5, we're always going to see Article 4, which makes me think that would they even openly, publicly disclose that they're going to have Article 5? Because right away, right when they do that, the thinking is Russia is going to immediately launch an attack in order to prevent that. So even the talk of Article 5 would provoke a Russian response. So would they keep this under the radar? Would they attempt to? And would they be able to is the other question. Would the Russians be able to pick up on this through various spying and surveillance capabilities, okay? So Russia, to prevent a concerted NATO attack, attacks first. The alliance and Russia are now entering into an open military confrontation. There's another possibility that in the Black Sea, the deaths of American pilots piloting a reconnaissance aircraft can also elicit a similar response. The American leadership responds with orders to shoot down a Russian plane or strike a Russian naval base. Moscow responds in retaliation. Now, Rand, this is what they would consider inadvertent or unintentional escalation. So something that was not intentionally provoked, even though you can make the argument that maybe some of this stuff is being done intentionally, kind of like a let it happen on purpose perspective. Experts consider deliberate escalation to be more likely. Ukraine, in the face of defeat, may in fact intensify its attacks on Russian territory. Is that what we're seeing right now? Now, this deliberate strategy of provoking the Russians I've already laid out would have to be permitted by the Americans, who, if they were against this, they would be saying, hey, stop doing this or we're not going to send you more weapons and long range, more capable weapon systems. Throughout all of this, the United States has enabled Ukraine with more capable weapons, and now, according to the Ukrainians, and a lot of the Russia bros aren't talking about this at all either, the drone war is just about to get started as Ukraine is training 10,000 people to fly drones of all shapes and sizes, ranges and capabilities into Russia to start this massive drone war. All right. Now, I guess we're going to see what the outcome of that is going to be, but that's why I don't think this war is even close to being over. So I know a lot of the bros subscribe to the Douglas McGregor, Scott Ritter idea that this is in the bag and Ukraine is done and this is Russia's war to lose. But, I mean, we just don't know yet. And I'm just going to humbly say that I don't know yet, okay? Even though that's what it might appear like on the surface, we also have to keep in mind that the art of war is, you would have to assume, even though we would think based on their blunders in Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq, that these guys don't have a lot of foresight just because of the way the military-industrial complex and the chain of command is structured right now, as it's so closely tethered to a election democracy and a political system which requires it turn over every 4 years. So everybody is thinking short term, whereas people like Vladimir Putin can think long term. Well, anyways, I'll just leave you to ruminate on that. But we can also see a situation like last year, and this is from a pro-Russian source, full disclosure, where the Zelensky regime might assemble a dirty bomb and fire it at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, claim that the Russians did something, blah, blah, blah. The Americans, while frightened the whole world that Moscow was about to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, and then they intervene, okay? Another possibility is that Moscow might carry out a limited attack on NATO forces on the territory of the alliance in order to stop or reduce the supply of Western weapons to Ukraine. The United States also considers underground nuclear tests that Russia might conduct as a deliberate escalation. And we reported just a few days ago that all three major nuclear superpowers are currently building up, and this is proven with satellite data, this is mainstream news, they're currently building up their respective nuclear test facilities in Nevada, in Novaya Zemlya up there in the Arctic, as well as in the deserts of China. I believe it's the Low-Reng Desert of China. So they're all doing this. So any of those things could be considered an escalation. The most interesting option for escalation is the creation of some kind of crisis outside Ukraine, which will force Washington to be distracted from Kiev. Okay, so this is another possible alternative. But there are numerous ways that escalation can happen at this point in time, and it appears as though that's where this is all heading. I cannot, for the life of me, comprehend how America would continue to turn the blind eye to Ukraine, targeting Russia's nuclear triad, knowing that Russia is going to obviously assume that this is NATO who is trying to undermine their strategic deterrence program, they wouldn't allow that to continue, especially if it was starting to seriously compromise their nuclear deterrence. Let me know what you guys think about this in the comment section below. There's lots of news to report on today, but honestly, I think this video is lengthy enough as is. Just keep on prepping. We have a very important video coming out for you this week because I'm really starting to get concerned about the prospect of a nuclear accident, or an intentional or unintentional one that is happening, being planned behind in the shadows. And for that reason, it's very important that we have a game plan for what we're going to do today. What are we going to do today if it goes down today? We're getting to the point where the time to prepare a plan is becoming narrower and narrower, and we need to make sure that we have that all dialed in before the proverbial crap hits the fan. Let me know what you guys think about all of this today. Do you think that they're serious about provoking a nuclear response? Because it appears as though they're doing nothing to stop Ukraine from doing so. They're doing nothing to, rein in Ukraine's sabotage attempts on Russia's nuclear triad. In fact, it's only ramping up, and they're enabling it even more. Now, looking at that trajectory, it appears as though the risk is very high that this outcome happens. What concerns me the most, and I'll be brutally honest with you, is not the prospect that this goes full-blown nuclear. Yes, that is possible. What I fear the most is the fallout from all of this. Sorry about the pun. I said I was just going to quit this video, but here we go. What I fear the most is not only the panic buying that is going to ensue, but the government's attempt to control the population when the panic sets in. All it's going to take is the use of one nuclear weapon for our governments to have free rein to do the final crackdown wherever they deem appropriate on free speech, on social media, on the various platforms that allow us to have this sort of discourse. It is going to enable them to enact some kind of low-intensity form of martial law before enacting the real one. Emergency War Powers Act. Every nation has a different term for it. That is my primary concern, along with the panic and the hysteria that's going to accompany it. One more nuclear detonation, and if you were to detonate a nuclear weapon right now in the current climate, even if it was just a test, I believe that people would be losing their frickin' minds, and that in itself could cause cascading effects, chain reactions throughout the markets. It could create ripple effects in the geopolitical spheres of the world where different conflicts might flare up, ones that have been lying dormant or ones that have just been festering under the surface or currently in the process of escalating will be expedited. Let me know what you guys think about this. Hope I gave you something to think about today. Just get ready, man. That's all I can say.